just to win. It's where your life begins. Yeah, there's no holding back, no overthinking. You've been reaching all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment to shine, to shine, to shine. This is your moment. You got to give it all that you got. Don't hesitate and don't ever stop. You spent a lifetime waiting for this day. This is your moment. Now's not the time for you to hold back. Don't overthink, it's time to react. The moment has come, don't let it slip away, away, away. It's closer than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins. You've tamed the voices in your head. You've put your courage to the test. Laid all your doubts to rest. Your mind is clearer than before. Your heart is full and wanting more. Your future's at the door. Give it all you got. No hesitating. You've been waiting all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment to shine, to shine, to shine. So shine on. And every time you hit the wall, remember you can have it all, even the mighty fall. It's closer than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins. Yeah, there's no holding back, no overthinking. You've been reaching all your life. This is your moment. This is your moment in time. This is your moment. This is your moment to shine, to shine, to shine. This is your moment. You got to give it all that you got. Don't hesitate and don't ever stop. You spent a lifetime waiting for this day. This is your moment. Now's not the time for you to hold back. Don't overthink, it's time to react. The moment has come, don't let it slip away, away, away. It's closer than it's ever been, and now it's more than just a win. It's where your life begins. You've tamed the voices in your head. You've put your courage to the test. Laid all your doubts to rest. Your mind is clearer than before. Your heart is full and wanting more. Your future's at the door. Give it all you got. No hesitating. You've been waiting all your life.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Samanthropolitics. Wow, what a few weeks. It has just been unbelievable. So we do have a winner of the U.S. presidential election. Joe Biden has won the United States presidency over Donald Trump, the Republican contender. And let's just look at the stats. So we have 306 votes for Joe Biden and 232 for Donald Trump. Arizona did end up going for Biden. Also, as of news today, Georgia has confirmed that Biden did in fact win the Georgia vote, despite Trump claiming over and over again that the Georgia vote was fraudulent and that somehow it wasn't correct and that he had won. I think the reality that Trump is having a hard time dealing with in Georgia is that the reason he lost is because people actually voted, and a lot of that was thanks to Stacey Abrams' efforts and Fair Fight getting so many people voted, especially people of color. So Biden also won about 6 million in the popular vote, which if you think back to 2016, Hillary won 3 million. So that amount is just pretty staggering. So it's really interesting that Trump, despite losing really in a landslide in terms of the electoral vote and the popular vote, is still claiming that he hasn't lost the election. It kind of reminds me of like a toddler that's hanging onto a toy and you're telling him like, all right, you got to share this with your brother. Like, let go of the toy, let go of the toy. And the kid's like, no, I won't let go of the toy. And it's like, you don't know how to like get this kid to like just give up his toy. So unfortunately, the result of Trump going on and saying that mail-in ballots were fraudulent, blah, 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 is that MAGA protesters swarmed Washington, D.C. last weekend wearing hats that proclaimed Trump Pence 2020 as if Trump had won in this alternate reality, huge Trump Pence flags. And in a poll, it says that 70% of Republicans now say that they don't believe the 2020 election was free and fair. That is highly, highly, highly concerning. Another thing that came out is, that I have been struggling with is the conspiracy theories. I mean, it's been very clear that once you let a conspiracy theory out of the box, like that mail-in ballots are somehow fraudulent, once it's out there, it doesn't even matter where it came from. It just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. Well, one of the things that was put into the air by Trump and a lot of his compadres was that the Democrats were somehow involved in these sex trafficking rings. And even though there was a guy that walked into Comet Pizza that was supposedly running a child sex trafficking ring, which was supposed to be running in the basement, he walked in there. There was no basement. It was all made up. 50% of Trump supporters still believe that top Democrats are involved in elite sex trafficking rings. And I will say that this weekend, interacting with some of those people, that was in fact the case, that they are still believing in conspiracy theories, and the ethos is that anything that I read or see is fake news, and therefore, CNN is telling me lies. Anything that comes out of my mouth has to be false. So something that's really I've been thinking about a lot is like, how do we have a uniform set of information that both the right and the left can subscribe to as a uniform set of facts, to say that X happened, because right now each side is saying that the other is all lies. There was also the very bizarre moment that Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, said in a really creepy response to a reporter when they asked about a transition. He said, yes, there will be a smooth transition to a second Trump presidency. And it was like, do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Like, what is going on? That was the Secretary of State. That was deeply upsetting, especially because of the Hatch Act. Pompeo is not supposed to be political, even though he's been political numerous times. Attorney General Will Barr has talked about authorizing prosecutors to proceed in investigating largely non-existent voter fraud. In addition, from a global perspective, country leaders popped up right away to congratulate Joe Biden on winning the presidency. More country leaders have congratulated Joe Biden on winning the presidency than Republican senators. So that's the other deeply concerning thing, is a lot of Republican senators that have also refused to say, yes, 100% Biden won the election, Trump is making this stuff up. And therefore, because he hasn't given up, there's no transition of power. I'm really excited. I have an amazing guest today that we're really going to dive into these things. So, without further ado, I think I'm just going to pop into my guest because I know he has amazing perspective on everything. So I'm just going to pop in. All right. So, Ambassador Peter Galbraith. So, Peter Galbraith is an American author, academic, commentator, politician, policy advisor, and former U.S. diplomat. Now, one thing that I find just amazing about him is how he has uncovered so many human rights atrocities, and it's just unbelievable. So one of the things was in the late 80s and early 90s, he actually helped uncover Saddam Hussein's gassing of the Kurds with enormous amounts of evidence. From 93 to 98, he was the U.S.'s first ambassador to Croatia, which also, keep in mind, was during the massive ethnic conflict within the Balkans, and he was co-mediator of the Erdut Agreement in 95 that ended the Croatian War of Independence and was part of a series of agreements to end the wars in the Balkans. He also served in East Timor's first transitional government, successfully negotiating the Timor Sea Treaty. Galbraith has also argued for Iraq to be partitioned into three parts, allowing for Kurdistan independence, and has acted as an advisor to the Kurdistan regional government in northern Iraq, also helping to influence the drafting process of the Iraqi constitution in 2005. No big deal. In 2009, Galbraith was appointed Assistant Secretary General of the UN and the United Nations Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan, and this was under Ban Ki-moon. Pretty unbelievable the way that he has weaved between, Senate advisory and the Foreign Relations Committee, into ambassadorship, and then into the United Nations. He also was a Democratic Vermont state senator from 2011 to 2015 and was a candidate for governor of Vermont in 2016. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in Ambassador Galbraith. Hi there.
Hi there, Samantha.
I'm so delighted I feel like you're just like a legacy or like a legend. I'm just thrilled that you're here.
Well, you're overly kind. Sometimes when I listen to my career going from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to ambassador to Croatia to member of the cabinet in East Timor, I think the trajectory is ever more important jobs in ever smaller places.
But that's where it gets interesting, right? Because the smaller the places that you can actually have an influence, right?
Well, for sure. There are various types in the foreign policy community. There are those who like to shape the broad policies, but I like being very operational and working on dealing with crises like the one in Croatia and Bosnia. And tomorrow is the 25th anniversary of the Dayton Agreement that ended the war in Bosnia. And the problems of East Timor of setting up a brand new country, where literally when we arrived, there was not a single public servant. 90% of the buildings had been burned. There were no records.
Wow.
As close to ground zero as you could get.
So, I was going to start with, us evaluating Trump, but I would love to just start in the Balkans because I just think it's fascinating, and maybe we'll set the stage for some things that are going on here. So you were, advising the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as the Berlin Wall fell, when there was this huge promise of democracy as like the beacon of everything. Democracy won, communism lost. And then all of a sudden ethnic conflict breaks out in the Balkans after Tito dies, and the Serbs are going and murdering Bosnians, everything's seceding. What was that like? You kind of hopped right in to like, hey, I'm an ambassador. Oh, hey, this whole place is at war. What's up?
Yeah. Well, of course, Croatia is a beautiful country.
I love it.
But in many ways, for a diplomat, this is what you really want to do. You want to be there at a time of crisis when you can make a difference. Otherwise, and being ambassador to Croatia now, you get to enjoy the beautiful country. I certainly did then too. But there are not huge issues between the United States and Croatia today. Um, the this was a unique moment in history when I was there, because the United States was the preeminent power in the world. The Soviet Union had disappeared. Russia and China were not in the position they are today. The European Union, it didn't even exist when I arrived. It was just in the process of being formed. It was the European Community. It was in disarray. And the US had just come off the first Gulf War with this incredible display of military technology and power. So as an American diplomat, when I spoke or when I pushed points on the different parties, they had to listen. Because if the U.S. couldn't make it happen, then it couldn't happen. This contrasts with the situation we have today, where America's influence is so much less than what it was. Now, some of that was inevitable. Russia was not going to stay down forever. China, it was rising and has now emerged as the world's second economy. But a great deal of it is a result of disastrous mistakes we have made in George W. Bush's administration, the invasion of Iraq, and even perhaps more importantly, the failure to plan and carry out a reasonable occupation. And then, of course, the last 4 years of Donald Trump and this bizarre, erratic behavior. It certainly helps that Joe Biden will be the next president. But the idea that the United States can get back to where it was in the 1990s, that isn't going to happen.
Yeah, another concern that a colleague of mine had said is that even with regards, because we've pulled out of all these agreements, that will the international community even trust us when we give our word that we're going to be part of the Paris Climate Accords again, or be part of another agreement, if in 4 years they think we're just going to pull out?
Yes, I think that with the Paris Climate Accord, that's less of a problem, because it's a commitments by countries to reduce emissions, and it doesn't they're not, if you will, reciprocal obligations. But the fact that we pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal will make it very difficult for the Iranians to come back in, and incidentally, because of U.S. action. I mean, they were in complete compliance with the agreement, but because of the U.S. action, they've said, well, if the U.S. is going to pull out and do things that are contrary to the agreement, then we're not obliged to follow it. That's a perfectly understandable course of action. And so they have increased their supply of low enriched uranium and done some things that were prohibited by the agreement. Again, I want to emphasize it was the U.S. that broke the agreement, not the Iranians. Now, President-elect Biden would like to resume the agreement. But the Iranians, I think, might well worry, well, if we do all these things for 4 years, maybe the U.S. will just break its word. So huge amount of damage has been done.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you hear about Trump all of a sudden deciding he wanted to launch strikes against Iran in the last months of his presidency?
I read the articles. The bad relations between the U.S. and Iran are something that are a little hard to understand. I have followed Iran all my career, and in 2015, I actually went there. You can't find a country in the world that's more pro-American than Iran. Every place we went, people would come up to us, where are you from? America. Oh, terrific, America, great. And it's also a place where the population doesn't believe in the system. When you go, I have a lot of Iranian friends, you go to their homes, first thing that happens is the scarves go off. And the second thing is, what would you like to drink? It's a rich culture. It's also a bitter enemy of Al-Qaeda and of Sunni extremism. It's very grateful that the U.S. got rid of Saddam Hussein and of the Taliban. So we have a lot more in common culturally and politically with Iran than with Saudi Arabia, which Iran is a much more democratic country than of course, Saudi Arabia is not democratic at all.
Mm. So how do you think, so if we're thinking about Biden's foreign policy in the Middle East, I've been thinking a lot about the concept of resets. Like how do you think, especially I think with both Iran and Saudi Arabia, how Biden should approach kind of each country and our allyship with them?
Well, first, I think we ought to be doing what we can to get back into the Iran nuclear agreement. It's politically going to be very difficult for the Iranians. They have elections in the summer. There's a lot of posturing. They're saying the United States should pay compensation for the damage that Trump did by violating the agreement. But obviously, that's not going to happen. And so I think that the hope is that they'll recognize the advantages of just going back into it. Iran has enormous economic problems and has been very, very badly affected by COVID. I would say part of it is that we ought to be providing humanitarian help for Iran to deal with the COVID crisis in the Muslim ban. And one of the reasons that Iran is so pro-American is so many Iranians have come to the United States and they've been educated here, including the foreign minister Zarif. They know our country. They like our country.
Mm-hmm.
Trump cut all that off, but that should be opened up. With regard to Saudi Arabia, we're entering in many ways, the post-oil world. So it just becomes much less important. The U.S.'s energy independent itself. We don't need to pander to the crown prince, who is a murderer, literally responsible for the murder of an American Washington Post journalist who murdered in the consulate in Istanbul and cut into pieces. And of course, also responsible for a ruinous war in Yemen that has created the greatest humanitarian crisis. So, I would hope that President Biden will pursue the Khashoggi case, but certainly most immediately stop U.S. support to Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen.
Yeah.
And with regard to Iraq and Syria, at the moment there's a very moderate minister in Iraq, probably somebody that the U.S. can work with. I certainly hope that, and I know that President Biden knows the Kurds very well. I know that because in 1990 I introduced him to the Kurdish leaders when he was a senator.
Amazing.
So I think he will be supportive of the one people there who have been our reliable allies, both in Iraq and Syria.
Right.
I hope that we do not continue with some effort to prolong the Syrian war by, resuming some support for an opposition that at this stage has no chance of winning.
So you think in Syria we should just I've been working with a Syrian journalist for years, and it's very close to my heart. Do we just leave it? What do we do in Syria?
Well, in the Obama administration, there was an effort to try to support the overthrow of Assad. I think the part of the reason that Assad survived is that the opponents included a significant element of Sunni extremists, and that was a real threat to Syria, which is a kind of mosaic of communities, including about 10% Christian, about 13% Alawite, which is a very funny version of Islam, which is what Assad is from, as well as Yazidis and Kurds and so on, Druze. And all those communities felt threatened by the opposition. So it never achieved a critical mass to prevail. And with Russian help and Iranian help, Assad has now won every place except the Kurdish-controlled area in the northeast. And there's no point in reigniting the conflict. I can be an interventionist as I was in Bosnia, but you should intervene only when you have a chance of success. And at this stage, there's no chance of success. Getting involved in militarily in opposition to Assad is simply a formula for getting more Syrians killed.
So I'm really interested by what you just said. How do you know when you have that chance of success? What are the markers?
It's interesting. In the foreign policy community and the academic community of national security scholars, people are so often looking for, lessons from one conflict to the other, if you will, markers for success. After my tour in Croatia, I was briefly at the AID and the USAID. They had this large project to identify failed states using all these metrics. But the reality is, it's something you see, and it's a result of knowing the place, knowing the region, rather than any specific markers. And the point is there in Syria a sufficient force that is opposed to Assad that could prevail? And that includes both in the population and in the defectors from the Syrian army, and that simply doesn't exist now. It may never have existed because the opposition ended up scaring Syria's minorities. I mean, substantial in number, who are supporting the regime, and they provided critical mass. If you look at what happened in the Arab Spring in 2011, when Ben Ali fell, the Tunisian leader, who lost? Well, Ben Ali and his family members, and they went off to Saudi Arabia. When Mubarak fell in Egypt, who lost? Well, Mubarak and his family. Some generals were forced to retire, so they are playing golf around Cairo. But if Assad had fallen, what you risked was a genocide against the Alawites, because the Sunni extremists see them as apostates, the departure of the Christians, perhaps a massacre of the Druze, and a threat to secular Sunnis who had also done extremely well under Assad. So there were enough people, there were too many people who were going to lose. And, there isn't it's simply looking at that specific situation. There aren't objective markers or standards that you can apply.
So going back to the Balkans, one thing, I mean, Mary Trump is constantly on, every TV, show. And I think it's because people feel like she has a unique understanding of the psychology of Donald Trump, which makes a lot of people really curious. You've dealt with leaders like Milosevic, who was a crafty, ethnic, entrepreneurial, stirrer of hate, land grabbing, horrible person, frankly. What do you, after kind of you've dealt with kind of these like dictators that are famous, frankly, like, do you have any insight into kind of Trump's psychology and of who he is and how he leads and why he won't give up power?
Well, there are distinctions. Milosevic was ruthless, crafty, and effective. And so he eliminated his opponents, killed Stambolic, his predecessor and mentor. And when the pressure got too great on him in Bosnia and Kosovo, he made the deals. Trump, I don't know that there it's very hard to think of another leader like Trump because, frankly, he's so incompetent.
Mm.
Um, and so erratic. These bizarre tweets. I mean, using Rudy Giuliani as his lawyer.
It's so funny.
You know, I mean, if Milosevic was there, Milosevic would figure out a way to stay in power.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, Trump. I mean, it's a farce. It's almost comic, except for the damage that's done to the United States. Um, so, um, if Trump may have it has an authoritarian personality. He may have dictatorial tendencies, but he's not competent enough to carry them out.
I mean, that's what some people are saying. That's a little scary. Is what if somebody comes along who's like Trump 2.0, but is actually far more strategic and more effective, but has his charisma and like messaging? Like, are we screwed?
Well, I mean, case in point, Richard Nixon,
Hmm.
who also had a authoritarian tendency, disregarded the Constitution, secretly invaded Cambodia, did Watergate, tried to stonewall, and that's where the term comes from. Watergate tried to stonewall the courts. Um, I think it never occurred to Nixon that he could simply defy the Supreme Court orders. Of course, he didn't have the Republican enablers that Trump does, where no matter what Trump does, almost all the Republicans, sit there and salute. So they can't even admit that Biden won the election, with a few notable exceptions like Mitt Romney.
Wait, why
Uh,
did Nixon not have Republican enablers? Like, what's the difference there?
Well, I guess the political culture was a little different. The Republican Party stood for something other than just power, and as they saw Nixon's violation of rule of law, his criminal conduct, um, they were they realized he had to go. I think some of it also had to do with the different politics of our country. It was much less tribal then than it is now in terms of the political parties.
Mm.
I mean, you went from 1964, where Lyndon Johnson got 60% of the vote, 61% of the vote, to 1972, where Richard Nixon got 60% of the vote. Huge swings.
Mm.
Um, that doesn't happen anymore.
Mm.
Biden got, Hillary won by 3 million votes. Biden won by 6 million. But he's at 51%, not 60, 65%, like the old fashioned landslides.
Mm, mm, mm. So let's talk about briefly. Something I did want to talk about today is, what is the danger of Trump refusing to concede power from a national security perspective and from a global perspective?
Well, first, I think we need to be clear that his failure to concede the election, doesn't mean he's going to stay in power. He will be gone at noon on the 20th of January.
I love what they
And
called him. They said, we have ways to remove trespassers from the White House. That made me really happy. Did you see the hilarious meme of like Trump talking about how the election was rigged while people are the movers are moving his stuff in the background?
no, I didn't
It's
see that
really
one.
funny. It's really funny. Anyway, yes, he will be removed from power, so you're accurate.
And one of the differences with Nixon is that the intelligence, the CIA, the FBI, the generals were all with Nixon. So if Nixon wanted to stage a coup, well, there were people who were with him. I can assure you that
Mm,
there are FBI agents who would like nothing more than to escort Mr. Trump out of the White House and possibly into a prison cell. I mean, the way he's insulted and treated the FBI, his abuse of the intelligence agencies, and his insults to the generals. So all of those, there are none of them that are going to be there to help him
mm,
uh, stay in power. Uh, that's the first point, is that he's going to go. The second point is, in terms of America's reputation around the world, of course, this is pretty appalling. I as a diplomat have pressed different countries to accept, and leaders to accept, the results of elections. And it's a little hard. Our credibility is a little diminished when the U.S. president doesn't accept the results of the elections. And then finally, the transition is a time when the new administration can really think through its policies, because once you get into office, you have to deal with everything in your inbox. You have to deal with all the issues that are coming up. This is the time to think things through. Obviously, President-elect Biden is himself very experienced. He has a very experienced team, including people who have served in the Obama and Clinton administrations. So, he'll be able to go through the transition without the kind of support. But it's a disgrace, and it will hurt the United States.
Yeah, I think it's so important to think about the fact how he's really undermining the legitimacy of the democratic process. And our country is based upon an idea of a peaceful transfer of power. And in countries that are democracies, a peaceful transfer of power is it's not just about it's not just about representation. It's about peaceful transfer of power. That's like a hallmark of a democracy, is that somebody wins an election and the other person accepts it and says, oh, okay, you won. It's not like a place like Belarus or Uganda right now where it's like, oh, you're getting more votes than me, or you could potentially win. I'm going to put you in jail and lock you up because I don't want you to win. Or we're just going to totally rig this, or, that's how these people also stay in power forever. So undermining kind of the democratic process itself is just, have we ever had a president that refused to concede ever in our history? Do you know?
No, there's never been a president. There have been some who behaved badly. John Adams, after losing to Thomas Jefferson, left town before the inauguration. Herbert Hoover, didn't help Roosevelt, and this is the middle of the Great Depression. But nothing quite like this. I think there's a broader point, which is, I think Americans, at least a sizable chunk of them, are going to start to lose confidence in our institutions. And if you think of it,
so dangerous.
But some of these, for example, the Electoral College. Joe Biden won this election by 6 million votes, but if 45,000 votes had been different in in Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia, or maybe it was Nevada, Trump would have won.
It's wild.
What is the Electoral College? It's not any act of genius. It's a system that was designed by, like the whole Constitution, by a bunch of white men, half of whom owned other people as slaves. And why we worship the founding fathers as a font of all wisdom, why conservatives are interested in the original intent. I don't give a flying you-know-what about the original intent of a bunch of slavehold owners. And the Electoral College was created to benefit slavery. Why? Because the Electoral College is determined by having the number of representatives and the 2 senators. And the number of representatives involves counting all the people, including slaves. In fact, they counted 3/5 of a person, but they didn't get to vote. So if you were a white slave owner, in effect, you got to cast the vote. You got the political benefit of your slaves by having an Electoral College. If you had popular election of the president, of course, the slaves either couldn't vote, or if they did, they weren't going to vote the way you wanted. So that's that. And then, just to do another institution, the Supreme Court. I don't think there's anybody who honestly believes those 5 justices in Bush v. Gore would have stopped the recount in Florida had Gore been ahead of Bush. They stopped the recount to make sure that Bush got into office. Well, when judges are supposed to, when they're faced with the same facts and the same law, they should come to the same outcome,
Right.
regardless of the political party. And since 2000, which is a 5-4 vote, we've added a bunch of additional very right-wing justices, including the three that Trump appointed. I mean, could we, if they make a ruling on the election, could we really trust it? Could we really think it was a judicial opinion rather than a political one? They aren't judges. They're an unelected additional chamber of the legislature. They might throw out the Affordable Care Act.
So do you think people are going to lose faith in, you're talking about losing faith in institutions. Obviously, we've lost faith in the Electoral College. Do you think people are also kind of losing faith in the Supreme Court as a sacred institution because of how Amy Coney Barrett was kind of railroaded in there?
I think people started losing faith. Certainly I did with Bush v. Gore, because again, those justices wouldn't have stopped the recount had Gore been ahead of Bush. But what has gone on since has made it an even more partisan court. It's not really a court. It is a unelected, legislative institution. Courts are meant to fairly adjudicate disputes. But one thing that Trump said that was right. He referred to Republican judges. Roberts took great offense, but he was right. Those are Republican judges, including Roberts.
It's so funny, Ambassador Galbraith, that you don't know this about me, but I do diversity and inclusion trainings. And one of the things that I do is unconscious bias training with corporations. And the whole idea of unconscious bias training is to make people understand and be aware of their biases so that they don't make decisions based on their biases. They make decisions based on objective facts. And yet in the political system, you just have all of these people that are openly, frankly, biased. And even, in the Supreme Court, they say, oh, I'm not biased. But like they clearly are, and they clearly act on those. And yet somehow that's okay. Even in corporate America, we're actually trying to like get away from that and show that like biases don't lead our actions. But then the whole judicial system is like this biased nightmare.
It certainly is a nightmare, because you cannot expect a fair hearing when you have a partisan judiciary, unless you happen to be on the side. Well, you can't expect it. If you're on the Republican side, then you're going to win. If you're on the Democratic side, you're going to lose. And why people should accept those kinds of results, I think they aren't going to accept it. Now, fortunately, this election was not so close that it ended up going to the Supreme Court.
Right.
But imagine if it did. I mean,
it's a terrifying prospect.
And imagine, what happens if the Affordable Care Act is invalidated?
Yeah. Or Roe v. Wade.
Yeah. I mean, Roe v. Wade, incidentally, I could make a separate argument. I support it, but you could make an argument, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg did, that this was appropriately something for the legislatures to decide. But the Affordable Care Act is a law passed by the Congress, which previously was affirmed by the Supreme Court. And so for the Supreme Court to change its previous ruling solely on the basis that one of the judges who voted in the affirmative is dead and been replaced by one by Amy Barrett, that's not what you expect a court. Courts have to be reliable.
So interesting. Do you think, okay, so I've been struggling with something that's been going through the news, because Gore's, where Trump's, accusation of that he won, I mean, it's just so far-fetched, it's unbelievable. With Gore, there was a reasonable case that he had won that election, especially with all of the hanging chads. Yet there's people that say that, the time that it took for the recount, and even when the Supreme Court finally made, they were like, okay, we need to be done with this, we need to move on, had something to do with intelligence gaps that then prevented us from seeing 9/11. I know there was a million other things, like having, silos between our different law enforcement agencies. Do you think there's any legitimacy to that kind of argument that pause had something to do with 9/11?
Well, the 9/11 Commission said that the transition process, the delayed transition process in 2000 made the Bush administration less capable in terms of handling the intelligence and looking at the threat. But the reality is that that Bush and his team were not paying attention. They were focused on other things.
Mm.
So I don't think that that was the uh, if they'd been focused on it and if they'd kept the focus that the Clinton administration had, yes, it might have been prevented.
Mm, mm. So something else that's been happening, um, that everybody might have been keeping track of, is that Trump has, since the election has happened, kind of erratically fired a whole bunch of people. So, including Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, because he had been opposed to the use of military force against protesters at Lafayette Square. He just fired, I mean, this is just so obviously conflicted of interest. It's just unbelievable. Homeland Security Cybersecurity Chief Christopher Krebs, because he declared the election to be secure, which is just unbelievable. It reminds me. So I had a friend that was at Department of Homeland Security, and she left because under the Trump administration, they wanted them to create an argument for why a wall would prevent terrorist attacks. And they were like, all of the evidence and all of the research that we've done shows that it absolutely will not prevent um, terrorist attacks. So there's no point of it. And they basically were like, okay, we'll figure out how to advocate for it. And so she resigned. But it's like the whole system used to be, okay, we're thinking about doing X. Let's go to the CIA, DHS, researchers and be like, tell me what the consequences of this be. Would this work? Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? And then they would make a recommendation, and then the president and the executive branch would make a decision. Versus the Trump administration having this agenda of, we want a wall. We don't care if it works. Go find an argument. Or even under Bush, the torture thing. It was like, figure out an argument for this to work. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm going on a tangent about that because it just upsets me so much. But do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
Um, well, it's certainly not the way to make policy. You look at the facts, and then your policies follow from them. You don't decide on the policy and then try to fit the alternate facts to support the policy. Yeah, so I mean, it really destroys the bureaucratic process. It destroys the quality of our intelligence when you operate this way. You raise the issue of these firings. I'm not too exercised by them. I mean, they're just Trump revealing what kind of character he is. But they would all be out of jobs in 60 days anyhow.
Wait, so what do you say? You say Trump revealing what kind of character he is. What kind of character is he? Can you dive into that a little deeper?
In this case, he's simply settling scores with people who criticized him.
Yeah.
And he has no loyalty to anything, as poor Jeff Sessions could tell him or could tell you. But when you're one of the features of being an effective leader is loyalty goes both ways. You don't just expect people to follow you and to be loyal to you. You also have to be loyal to them. That's a real part of the system of being effective. I mean, Biden is very good in that way, but Trump, if he doesn't like the advice he's got, or the fact that Mark Esper said that it was appropriate to use military force against American citizens, he stewed over it, and then as soon as the election was over, he fired him.
Yeah.
But Mark Esper was not going to be defense secretary on afternoon on the 20th of January anyhow.
What do you think? So you think that the reasons for the firings are more about settling scores and less about, I mean, other hypotheses is that Trump wants to disclose, like declassify highly sensitive intelligence, and another hypothesis is that he wants a foreign policy win by withdrawing, half of our troops from Afghanistan. Do you think that either of those have credibility in terms of reasons he's firing all these people?
Uh, no, there's nothing in Trump's behavior to suggest he's particularly strategic. I mean, he's
Right.
impulsive, vindictive. Um, if he wanted to declassify the intelligence, he could do so. Um, what some of the people at the CIA have said is that the intelligence is actually pretty damning of him. So, I think that there's just a vindictiveness of wishing to hurt the CIA's sources, because if you declassify, then the Russians, presumably, or whoever it is, but probably the Russians, will be able to figure out who your source is.
Mm.
And so it's really payback. To understand this, it's what he really wants to do is pay back the Russian agents, CIA agents, who sort of blew the whistle on what was going on.
Mm.
Uh, and of course, the effect of that will mean that you would never be able to recruit any agents again, because once your cover is blown, you risk imprisonment or even death. Uh,
Mm.
but so again, I think that's just part of the Trump vendetta.
Mm. I have a question from the audience. It's actually from one of my favorite volunteers when I was on Secretary Clinton's campaign in Florida, Bob Trombetta, who's an amazing activist down there. He wants to know, does your guest have a desire to get back in the game in a Biden administration?
Well, thank you, Bob, for that question. Um, I've always made it a firm rule never to turn down a job I haven't been offered.
Would you
I,
want to serve again, though? I mean, are you interested?
if I were asked and I thought I could make a contribution, for sure I would. But there are an awful lot of very talented people um, out there, and also younger. So that's the way it is. I will say I have met President-elect Biden 41 years ago, and I worked with him for 14 years when he was on the Foreign Relations Committee. So I have a great deal of respect and admiration for him. So I think he would be a terrific person to work for, and I will be admiring and perhaps a bit jealous of all those who are going to work for him.
I mean, that the idea that you wouldn't have a contribution is almost hilarious to me. Um, considering you've gone from East Timor to Croatia. Um, can I just actually ask you a question? Something that's like been bothering me so much, and I'm wondering if this is going to shift. That there's only one woman on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee right now, Jean Shaheen. Like, has the Senate Foreign Relations Committee always been so male? Like, what is the deal there?
Well, when I was there was one woman working for it. There was one woman in the Senate, Nancy Landon Kassebaum.
Oh my
Uh,
God, that is wild.
she was on the committee, so I hadn't
Oh.
realized that there was only one woman on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Um, I don't know, there are probably around 20 women in the Senate now, 2025.
Okay.
And certainly they hold positions on a number of important committees. Um, Patty Murray is the chair of the Homeland Security Committee.
Hmm.
Any, or I was sorry, the ranking Democrat. So um, uh, I think it's just a function of the distribution of senators, and not these days a lot of senators want to be on committees that where the money is, like appropriation of finance, as opposed to
Mm,
foreign.
interesting. So to go back to the other side of the world, and away from America for a second, we got Trump out. Thank goodness. I mean, I was gonna thank the Lord. I don't really necessarily believe in that, but like, inshallah, like thank God. What about what do you think about how we deal with some of the other populist governments that are rising, like Poland and Hungary? Um, how do we, especially, I mean, I'm particularly concerned about what you said at the very beginning of this, which was that we just don't have the influence that we once had. So what's your kind of proposition for dealing with some of these populist leaders?
Well, precisely. That we don't have the same influence. And if we deal with the leaders in Poland and Hungary, both of them are in the European Union. And so, the European Union is the institution and the members that are going to have to solve the problem in both those countries, particularly with Viktor Orban in Hungary. I think that the United States can play a role, not the least because Hungary and Poland owe their freedom to the fact that the United States stood by them through the long, dark years of the Cold War and of Soviet domination. And so, this kind of leadership is unacceptable, and we ought to be pushing them to behave in a more democratic fashion. But again, this is Europe, and it's really Europe's responsibility.
Do you think too, so, one of the things that I kind of study are social movements, and do you think that, so like for years, a traditional kind of, and we talked about with Syria, a traditional mechanism of U.S. foreign policy was um, um, emboldening kind of military opposition or giving weapons to the opposition. But now, like, for example, this new abortion law that was super strict in Poland was just, I think parts of it were reversed when there were mass social protests in the streets by a lot of women. And I'm wondering if, and maybe it is part of US foreign policy already, but to think about how do we arm civil society groups, not with weapons, but like how do we arm the movements, just like in the Arab Spring, to make those changes instead of just through violent means?
Well, certainly the use of soft power is actually so much more effective than military force. I mean, if we talk about Iran, the way Iran is going to change is because of all these people who have come to the United States, people who've gone to university here, the contacts we have, that rich culture. And I visited as a high school student. I spent 11 weeks in the Soviet Union camping, driving around the country.
No way.
Yeah, I spoke Russian at the time, and I was also in Eastern Europe then in 1971. And what struck me about those places is that nobody believed in communism, particularly after the invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68. There were plenty of communists because that's how you went ahead, but they didn't believe in the doctrine or the inevitability of communist triumph or Marxism and Leninism. And basically, it's the same situation in Iran. So a military strike in Iran is not going to, it'll strengthen the regime. The sanctions strengthen the regime. People-to-people exchanges, having more normal arrangements, that's going to be the thing that's going to produce change. It's no accident that the only communist countries left in the world are North Korea and Cuba, which is to say the countries that have been most isolated. But the other thing I would caution about, I think, we need to be cautious about how much we, the United States, do. I don't think we ought to be funding or creating NGOs. And not every problem is our problem. I remember in 2011, the State Department called me and said, we want to consult with people who had been in conflict situations and so on. What do you think we should do about the people, in Tahrir Square? This was before Mubarak fell. And my answer is, why should we do anything about it? This is for the Egyptians to do it. We are not the people to solve to shape somebody else's movement or to solve somebody else's problems. And I think that we need to get away from.
Mm, mm. So that the other thing that you mentioned is another area of a super curiosity of mine, which is sanctions as like the other stalwart of foreign policy tools. And I was actually going to bring up before that the sanctions have hurt Iranians. So what do you think? What do you think about sanctions as a foreign policy lever in general?
Well, I think they can be useful, especially when they're multilateral. They were extraordinarily effective against Serbia during the Croatia and Bosnia wars, and basically brought the Serbian economy to its knees, and ultimately this persuaded Milosevic to accept the peace. The Iraq sanctions that began when Saddam invaded Kuwait and continued until 2003 kept Iraq weak, although the human suffering was enormous, and there wasn't any real end game to it. In the case of the Serbia sanctions, there was an end game, namely, make peace in the Bosnia War, in the atrocities. But there wasn't in the case of Saddam for the sanctions. But in the case of Iran, I just think they're wildly counterproductive. They're because the way in which change will occur is by engagement with the United States, not by isolating them. Look what happened to the Soviet Union. It was when we embraced Gorbachev and got friendlier relations, and then the whole place disappeared.
Yeah, it's funny. I went on the Taiwanese government selected like 20 young future politicians from America and did a people to people exchange. They took us to Taiwan. We interfaced with their young diplomats. They like toured us around the country. It was hugely effective. Like, I'm always going to feel like super protective over Taiwan from this trip that I had when I was, 28 years old. I think you're right. It is super effective, and to create those friendships with, and I'll always think of Taiwanese people as like the friendliest people I've ever met. They are just, I think Taiwanese and Kiwis are just the friendliest people ever. I think soft power is, and it's been really upsetting. I think one of the things under Trump to see a lack of understanding of soft power, and a lack of seeing how effective soft power is. So, anyway, I know we're running short on time. Ambassador Galbraith, I have one more question for you. Actually, can I ask two more questions?
Certainly.
Okay. I know you've done a lot of work with the Kurds. One of the things that Trump did, and we did an episode 2 months ago with a woman who's worked in the Rojava region of Syria, who documents human rights abuses of women there, and she's just seen how it's just gone wild with the Turkish invasion of the Kurdish region. And that was mainly because Trump gave the green light and was like, oh yeah, Turkey, you want to go invade? Sure, have a good time. Bye, have fun, have a nice vacation. How do we, and I've talked to, one of my friends who might be watching said he was, one of the last American soldiers there, and he kind of wanted to die leaving the Kurdish region because he just felt like we were just abandoning our allies. Like, how do we, after that, how can we repair that relationship? But it seems unbelievably difficult to be able to do.
Yeah, so I know this region well. I've made 15 trips there since 2014, including in September, just before Trump's betrayal, and in November, just afterwards. And of course, they were in huge shock. We, in terms of fighting the Islamic State, we had the air power, but without troops on the ground, it doesn't work. They were our troops on the ground. They took 15,000 dead. We had 5 American casualties.
Wow. Did everyone hear that? 15,000 Kurds and 5,000 Americans for our war.
Well, it was to be fair, it was their war too, because ISIS was attacking them as well.
That's true.
But if you betray your allies, the next time ISIS emerges, and it is there and it is going to reemerge, you might have the Americans having to do all the fighting. And so we might not have 15,000 casualties because our forces are better equipped and have better protection, but we might have thousands. So it really does matter if you have allies, but then you have to treat your allies decently. The other thing, as I'm sure you know about Rojava, this area of northeast Syria, it's engaged in an absolutely astonishing social experiment.
Yeah.
So that when you go there, you meet with government officials, you meet with there are three cantons, each has a prime minister, one's a man, one's a woman. The legislatures are 50-50. There are male fighters and female fighters, male generals, female generals. The president of the whole region, they're co-presidents, one man, one woman. All the political parties have co-leaders, one man and one woman. Also, it isn't just Kurds, but there might be a Christian or an Arab. And then when I was walking around in the town of Amude, which is right on the Turkish border, I went by a building. My interpreter said, "You know what this is? It's Gen TV. It's a television station in which every employee, from management to the anchors to the reporters to the cleaning staff, are women."
That's gonna be mine. I'm starting right now. I'm staff of one, but I'll have. That's amazing.
Yeah, no, it's quite extraordinary what they've accomplished. And as a Vermonter, I have to point out that they're actually applying the ideology and philosophy of Murray Bookchin, who was a guy who moved to Vermont as a philosopher after Bernie Sanders was elected mayor of Burlington. He wanted to help create the socialist experiment in Burlington, Vermont.
Murray. So what was Murray's philosophy?
Well, there were three elements to it. One was strict gender equality. Second is representation of different communities, which they do in northeast Syria. So, in the U.S., you'd have representation of labor, of management, of teachers, of students. I mean, the whole thing would be part of the system. They are representing the Christian community, the Arabs, the Yazidis in top positions. And the final element of is radical environmentalism. That part they are a little weak on in northeast Syria, but they aspire.
I think it's so important to get those messages because, during one issue with the Bush era was that this perception of, we're going in there to save these oppressed women, and yet they're doing like the most progressive feminist social experiment in a mostly Islamic country.
Yes. I really think we should. I mean, we have such arrogance about it. Everything is sort of made in America, done by America. Of course, we're a powerful country. We've done a lot of good in the world, but other countries are doing things too. We went into Iraq with the idea that we would remake Iraq into something that it had never been, which would be a multi-ethnic state where people were not divided on ethnic or sectarian grounds. But the reality is that the Kurds never wanted to be Iraqi. They've always wanted to have their own independent country. And we can't change their attitudes. And in Afghanistan, there are powerful Afghan women, but this isn't something that we need to impose.
Right. It's been really interesting seeing a lot of people who in the humanitarian space who've done work abroad on things like conflict resolution, mediation, reproductive rights, racial equity, or just diversity, come back to the U.S. now and go, I've been working like in these other countries for years, and like I think America needs my help. Like I thought America was fine, but like we're not doing so hot.
Yeah, the Carter Center has had programs for decades to help to monitor elections. Jimmy Carter kind of pioneered that. And to assist countries in democracy. This year, they put their focus on the United States for the first time. So, yeah, these are issues that we have to deal with at
So
home.
let's end on this is actually a great segue into my last question for you, which is I know that one of your close friends for years, who unfortunately was murdered, was Benazir Bhutto, the first female head of an Islamic country and the first to have a baby in office. Now Jacinda Ardern is the second. Um, I would love to hear about your thoughts on her as a leader and how she kind of changed norms in that world.
Well, she was somebody I met on my first day in college. She was a 16-year-old freshman, uh, and we were friends, up till literally the day she died, because I also worked on Pakistan for many years. Um, her just she went to Oxford after Harvard, and where I also went, and then she went back to Pakistan in June of 1977, and on July 4th, her father was overthrown by the military chief of staff, General Zia Haq, who then put her father on trial and had him hanged. And so it all fell to her at age 77, age 24, I think,
Wow.
um, to carry on the struggle, and she carried it on for 11 years. She was put in prison. The Zia regime tried to basically have her die. I think what saved her was the fact that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee got engaged and were saying, if you forget about the aid package if you allow Benazir to die. And so they took her out of this hellhole, the whole of Calcutta kind of prison, and put her into somewhat better conditions, and eventually released her
I'm sure
after
you had a
5.
role. I'm sure you had a role in that, that's friendship.
In any event, she was just the bravest person I knew.
Mm.
Uh, and, in many ways, she knew what fate awaited her, but she was just, she had her duty and her obligation. And I think, I think what were their special qualities of her because she was a woman? Um, I think to some degree her both physical and moral courage were part of, and her determination. I mean, those were and and the way she communicated in Pakistan, I think were very important. In office, well, she was overthrown by the military both times in office, but she did do a number of things to promote women's rights and educational opportunities. Also, in her first term, to restore freedom of the press and freedom of expression, and that sort of thing. Um, and she was murdered when she was campaigning for her third term in a terrorist attack by the Pakistani Taliban, but perhaps with the involvement of the Pakistani military.
Wow. So you feel like she kind of knew that that was eventually going to be her destiny, but kind of just was like, this is my duty and I'm just going to keep going because I can't just be scared.
Yeah, I think she was as a mutual friend of ours described her. She was a Homeric figure, in the sense of somebody who knew her fate, but and couldn't change her fate, but carried forward. Now, I mean, she, she, did on the day she died, she didn't specifically don't go out to get killed.
Right,
Um,
right, right, right.
but she was determined not to let the terrorist threat block her election campaign.
Wow. What would you say to her now if she was still alive?
Well, I mean, it's now 13 years. First, I'd just be really grateful to see her. Uh, and she would have won the elections in 2008. Um, Her husband took over, and he did win the elections. He became
Mm.
president. Um, It's a hard question. I think what one does with friends, if you haven't seen them for a long period of time, you spend a huge amount of time getting caught up.
Well, what would you say in terms of if you could tell her about like the legacy that you feel like she set as the first woman to head an Islamic country? What would you tell her about like her legacy?
Um, well, it was very simple actually. And so November 16th, just a few days ago, was the 32nd anniversary of her winning election for the first time. And actually was with her in her living room. There were about 6 or 7 of us listening to the
Wow,
returns.
it's
Um,
wild.
and uh, what I would say was that was her finest moment, not winning an election per se, but by winning the election and becoming prime minister, she ended 11 years of dictatorship and restored democracy. And
Wow,
that was just a huge achievement. Um,
unbelievable.
and I think in many ways that overshadowed anything, any of the concrete achievements, of which there were some. But
Mm,
the concrete achievements in government, often are marginal. I mean, you're more money for girls' education, which she certainly did. Um, uh, Various foreign policy initiatives. But for a country like Pakistan, its foreign policy initiatives aren't going to change the world. But what really changed Pakistan was restoring democracy.
mm, that's gives me chills. So unbelievable. And to think about you kind of meeting her at when she was 16 years old as like a freshman, like kind of excited to like be in school is just ah unbelievable. Well, I want to thank you so much, Ambassador Galbraith. This has just been an honor, and I feel like I could just pepper you with a million more questions about, you're so knowledgeable about every region of the world. And, like wherever I throw at you, you're like, oh yeah, well let me tell you about what's going on there. So I know myself and whoever is watching this, I'm sure would say that you would be a gigantic, unbelievable asset to a Biden administration. So, as an American, I for one hope that you end up serving.
Well, you're most kind, and it would be even terrific if President-elect Biden were listening to your show.
Ah, okay. You get to send it to him. This is your task. I'm assigning you to send Samanthropolitics to President Biden. That would be, I think, my shining moment. Really, would be seeing him watch my show.
Anyhow, it's really a wonderful show and very good questions. And so I very much enjoyed our interaction.
Me too. All right. Thank you, Ambassador Galbraith. I will see you soon.
Okay.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
Uh, well, we have touched so much on this show. What do we do in the Middle East in terms of resetting with Iran and Saudi Arabia? Really happy to hear from Ambassador Galbraith that we don't need to suck up to a murderous prince anymore. We've talked about kind of, when you can use sanctions effectively and when they're not effective. We've talked about the Iran nuclear deal. We've talked about when you support military oppositions and how do you know when it's the right time to apply military pressure versus soft power. This was not just an interview. This was a tremendous lesson in foreign policy for anyone that is interested in doing foreign policy effectively and in a way that doesn't piss lots of people off. So I really hope that you enjoyed this interview. I know it was unbelievably stimulating for me as a graduate student of foreign policy or former graduate student of foreign policy at the Fletcher School. So we still have some amazing guests coming up in the next week, more people that will probably serve in the Biden administration. And we're going to also be covering some of the other things happening in the world, like Ethiopia and the constitution that's now in evolution in Chile. So if you like the show, please hit the like button on the Facebook page, Samanthropolitics. share if you care about foreign policy or about, U.S. policy with your friends, about feminism. If you want to share it with Joe Biden and you have a personal connection, I won't be insulted. Please, by all means, go ahead and do that. That would be awesome. I'm also taking applications again. Some of you know I teach a women's leadership program, which is now going to be a 12-week awesome program where you meet women from around the world and discuss kind of things like deconstructing the patriarchy, things that are holding you back, how to start a social movement, how to create change within your company for gender equality. It is an awesome class. It has awesome women. So I'm taking applications for that for the January and February cohorts. So I'll stick a link to that in the chat, but that's from my website, which is Empower Global. So again, I'll stick a link to that in the chat. It's www.empowerglobal.net. /new/online challenge, and I guarantee you it will transform your life because the women are amazing and it is just, I'm obsessed with it. That's it for today, and I am super excited to be broadcasting from having a new president-elect, and I'm really excited to see us not have to constantly talk about how we are damaging and destroying things, but actually how we're moving forward. So thanks again for watching. Thank you to my sponsor, Stream Inspectors, for your amazing support and for designing these incredible graphics that are around me. And we'll see you next week on Samanthropolitics. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Oh, and have a great and happy and joyful and gobblicious Thanksgiving. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.